7 times rejected, 31 years old, the last woman standing on a bride platform. Clara Whitmore watched every other woman get chosen while men's eyes slid past her like she was made of glass. Too old, too plain, too much of a failure. Then the richest rancher in 3 territories rode in late and walked straight past every young, pretty face to stop right in front of her. His question wasn't, "Are you beautiful?" It was, "How many times have they passed you over and why do you keep trying?" What he saw in her answer would change both their lives forever. This story carries a truth that every woman who's ever felt invisible needs to hear. Your rejections aren't failures. They're just clearing the path to the person wise enough to see your worth. Sometimes the right one arrives late, and sometimes being chosen last means you were saved for someone who actually deserves you. If Clara's journey touched something in your heart, leave a comment telling us, have you ever felt invisible until someone finally saw the real you? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of hope, strength, and second chances. And if you know a woman who needs to hear this today, share it with her. She might be one story away from believing in herself again. The September sun over Dawson Creek was merciless. Clara Whitmore stood at the end of the line, her hope worn as thin as her dress. This was her 7th time on a bride platform. At her age, unmarried and alone, she felt more like a ghost than a woman. Mrs. Hendricks, the coordinator, called out instructions. Be proper, be dignified. Dignity. Clara nearly scoffed. Dignity did not fill an empty stomach or put a roof over your head. She was number 12 out of 13 women, unlucky from the start. Beside her, a young girl named Emma trembled, barely 19. It was her first time. Her family was gone, her farm sold for debts. Clara tried to offer a kind word. "Mom, you will be fine," she said, knowing it was true for a pretty young thing like Emma. It was the women like Clara, too old and too plain, who were always left behind. The air grew thick with cheap perfume and quiet desperation. Some women prayed. Clara did not bother. She had run out of prayers 3 years ago. "Gentlemen are approaching," Mrs. Hendricks announced. "Stand straight. Smile." A group of ranchers and farmers walked down the line, their eyes judging, calculating. It happened just as Clara expected. A farmer stopped at Emma, asked a few questions, and raised his hand. She was chosen. Relief washed over the young girl's face. One by one, other women were picked. A shopkeeper chose a quiet brunette. A kind-eyed rancher claimed a cheerful woman named Molly. Each time, a future was decided in a single moment. The men's eyes would land on Clara's face for a second and then slide right past, as if she were made of glass. Too old, too thin, not what they wanted. Soon, only 3 women remained. The last 2 suitors were a shaky old man and a nervous boy. Neither of them wanted the women who were left. They would not even look at Clara. It was over. "I have money for my own ticket back," one of the other women said sharply. Clara said nothing. She had $17 tucked away. It was enough to get to Denver, maybe. Enough to start over as a seamstress, invisible all over again. Mrs. Hendricks nodded, relieved. "The train departs at 5. The society wishes you the best." The best. What a cold way to describe a future of slow, quiet starvation. Clara picked up her bag, feeling numb. The platform was clearing as new couples gathered. She saw young Emma start to walk toward her, her face full of pity. Clara turned away. She could not bear anyone's kindness right now. She took a step toward the stairs, ready to leave this town and this failure behind forever. That is when she heard it. The thunder of hooves, galloping hard. A huge bay stallion slid to a halt, and a man swung down from the saddle. It was Jonah Mercer. Even a newcomer like Clara knew that name. He was the most powerful rancher in 3 territories, and he was very, very late. He stood tall, covered in trail dust, with a look on his face that commanded respect. His gray eyes, the color of a storm brewing, missed nothing. He was a hard man, built for a hard country. "I am here for the bride selection," he announced, his voice carrying easy. "Train was delayed. I sent word." Mrs. Hendricks gathered herself. "Sir, the selection is already over." His gaze swept over the women left behind, Margaret, Ruth, and Clara, who stood still as a frightened deer. "You telling me every single woman is spoken for?" he asked, pointing with his chin toward the 3. Some ladies are still available, the woman said carefully. But for a man of your standing, Mr. Mercer, we can arrange a special selection from the next group. Do not need a special selection, Jonah said, his eyes now fixed on the three women. He walked right past the stunned matchmaker. He walked past Margaret, who eyed him with suspicion. He walked past Ruth, who did not even bother to look up. He stopped right in front of Clara. The air felt thick. Clara could smell dust and leather, and the man himself. He had a scar through his left eyebrow, and his hands looked strong and capable. "Your name?" he asked, his voice low. "Clara Whitmore," she whispered. "Age?" The truth felt like a stone in her throat. 31. A murmur went through the small crowd. Too old, long past her prime. "They passed you over today?" Jonah asked. The blunt question was a strange relief. "Yes." "How many times before?" "6. His expression never changed, but something in his eyes softened. "And you keep trying." It was not a question. "I keep trying," she confirmed. "Wait, I swim." She took a breath because not trying is worse. Jonah just looked at her for a long moment, the platform silent around them. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Keep a house?" "Yes, I can also read and write. I was a teacher." "Was?" he asked. "Before things changed," she said, leaving the story of her family's debt and ruin unspoken. He nodded, seeming to understand. "I have a ranch," Jonah said. 15,000 acres north of here. It is hard work. I need a partner, not a pretty thing to sit on the porch. I need a woman with some backbone." Clara could only nod, her throat suddenly dry. "I am not looking for a girl who needs saving from the world," he said, his voice quiet now. "Just for her. I am looking for a woman who has already survived it. Do you understand?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "I am 42, he went on. "A widower. My wife and baby died 4 years ago. My house needs a woman, and my life needs sharing. I work hard, and I keep my word. I expect the same." Clara felt a tremor of hope, something she had not felt in years. He stepped back and raised his voice for all to hear. "Clara Whitmore, would you be willing to court me with an eye toward marriage?" The platform buzzed with shocked whispers. Mrs. Hendricks gasped out loud. In Jonah Mercer's eyes, Clara saw something new. Not pity, not disappointment, but respect. Pure and simple respect for a woman who kept getting back up. "Yes," Clara heard herself say, "I would." Jonah gave a single, firm nod. He turned to the stunned Mrs. Hendricks. "What is the procedure?" "A 1-week supervised courtship," she stammered. "Chaperone meetings to see if you are compatible." "Fine," Jonah said. "Where does she stay?" "At Mrs. Brennan's boarding house. The society." "I will pay for it," he cut in, pulling out a thick wallet. He handed the money to Mrs. Hendricks. "I will call on you tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock, he said to Clara. "Is that acceptable?" "Yes," she managed. He touched the brim of his hat to her, a small sign of courtesy that meant the world. Then he walked to his horse, mounted in one smooth motion, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a platform full of stunned people. Clara stood frozen, her bag clutched in her hands. The world came rushing back in a roar of gossip and disbelief. "Well," Mrs. Hendricks said, all business again, "that was unusual. Miss Whitmore, please follow me." As Clara walked away, she heard one of the other women, Margaret, say loud and clear, "About time someone around here chose quality over a pretty package." Emma, the young bride from earlier, ran to her side and squeezed her hand. "Oh, Miss Clara, he is the richest man in the territory. Isn't it wonderful?" Clara looked at the girl's happy face and felt a tiny, dangerous flicker of something like hope. "Ask me in a week," she said softly. "Then I will know if it is real." The town was small, and by the time she reached the boarding house, the owner, Mrs. Brennan, already knew everything. "You are the one," she stated, leading Clara upstairs. "You are the one Jonah Mercer chose." Mrs. Brennan gave Clara a quick tour of the small, clean room. She laid out the house rules and said supper was at 6 o'clock sharp. Before the leaving, the older woman paused. "Jonah Mercer is a good man," she said, her eyes serious. "He needs a partner, not a hired hand. Can you be that for him?" Clara, who had survived on her own for 7 long years, looked right back at her. "I reckon I can manage with a little help." Once the door closed, Clara sank onto the bed. her legs finally starting to shake. The wealthiest rancher in 3 territories had chosen her. The question that kept circling her mind was simple. Why? Clara needed to move, to quiet the storm in her head. She went to the window and looked down at the dusty main street of Dawson Creek. Life was just carrying on as if her whole world hadn't been shaken like a jar of beads. They were set to talk in the morning, at 9 o'clock. She pressed her forehead to the glass, letting herself feel the raw terror for just a moment. It was not a fear of him, but a fear of hope. 7 times she had been passed over. She was terrified to believe this time could be different, only to have that hope snatched away like all the rest. A knock at the door startled her. It was Emma, another young woman staying at the boarding house, her eyes wide with excitement. "Isn't it just grand we're here together?" she asked, bouncing onto the bed. "Everyone in town is buzzing. They say Mr. Mercer could have had his pick of any woman. Why do you think he chose you?" Clara simply answered, "I truly do not know." Emma's smile faded into a thoughtful look. "I watched you on that platform. You stood so straight, even when you were the last one left. You weren't beat. I thought to myself, if I can just be half that strong, I'll be okay." Clara's throat went tight. Emma, a sweet girl from the boarding house, said maybe Mr. Mercer saw something special in her. Maybe he saw a partner, someone strong enough to stand right beside him. Before Clara could think on it, Mrs. Brennan called that supper was in 15 minutes. Emma hurried off, leaving Clara with a wild thought. What if Jonah Mercer wasn't looking for a fragile flower, but for someone with enough grit to face down the storms this rugged country could throw at them? It was a strange and terrifying idea. She put on her only good dress, a mended dark blue cotton, and pinned her hair up. In the mirror, she saw a plain woman of 31, with lines around her eyes and a face that had seen too many hard years. But her eyes, her mother used to call them steady eyes. They were gray-green and didn't flinch from the truth. Maybe, just maybe, that's what Jonah Mercer saw. Supper was a lively affair. The other women chattered about their new lives, but Clara felt like an outsider. An older woman named Adelaide was talking about Mr. Mercer's ranch, the Triple Creek. She said his cattle were the best in the territory, and folks came from as far as California to buy his horses. Another woman gasped that he had 30 cowboys working for him. Then Beth, a quiet woman with sad eyes, spoke up. She said his first wife, Catherine, had managed it all. She died 4 years ago having a baby. The table went silent. Beth said Jonah nearly broke from the grief, locking himself away for months. He never fully got over it. Clara gripped her fork. She was being considered by a man who had loved his wife that much. "A lonely man," Beth added, looking right at Clara. "He's recovered, but he ain't healed." Those words echoed in Clara's mind all night. She couldn't read, couldn't settle. She just kept thinking about that question he'd asked her. Why did she keep trying? She lay in bed listening to the house settle down. For the first time, she allowed a dangerous thought to take root. What if this time was different? After 7 rejections, what if the 8th time was the charm? Rejection was familiar. She knew how to survive it. But hope, she thought, hope could ruin her completely. She would find out at 9 o'clock in the morning. Morning came too fast. By 8 o'clock, Claire was dressed in a simple gray cotton outfit, her hands shaking as she pinned her hair into a bun. Emma popped in, glowing with excitement about her own suitor. She asked what Clara and Mr. Mercer were going to do. "Just talk," Clara said. "It's a practical arrangement, Emma, not a fairy tale." Emma smiled. "My mother always said love that grows slow lasts longer than love that burns fast." The thought stuck with Clara as she went downstairs to wait for the man who held her future in his hands. Have you ever been told you are not good enough? Clara Whitmore had heard it 7 times before. But today, a rancher named Jonah Mercer was waiting for her downstairs, and she had a feeling this time would be different. This story is about how real strength is found in surviving, not just in succeeding. Jonah stood in the parlor, looking as out of place as a bull in a church. He was a big man, cleaned up in a crisp shirt and vest, his storm gray eyes finding hers the moment she walked in. He nodded. "Miss Whitmore." She moved into the room, feeling the landlady's eyes on them both. "You are early, Mr. Mercer." He gave a simple shrug. "I would rather be an hour early than a minute late. Please sit. We need to talk." Jonah did not waste time with small talk. I value honesty, Miss Whitmore, so I am going to be straight with you. He leaned forward, his voice low and serious. I am 42 years old. I built my ranch from scratch. My first wife, Catherine, was a sweet girl, but the frontier life was too hard for her. The loneliness just broke her spirit long before she passed. He looked Clara right in the eye. I do not need a girl looking for an adventure. I need a woman who understands that life out there is hard work. Someone tough. And what makes you think I am that woman? Clara asked, her voice quiet. Because you have been passed over 7 times and you are still standing, he said plainly. That tells me you have got grit. So you chose me because I have failed so many times, Clara said, a little sharp. No, Jonah corrected her gently. I chose you because you survived failing. There is a big difference. The ranch will test you. I need someone who will not fold when things get hard. Your history says you do not fold. It was the strangest compliment she had ever gotten, but it felt warm and true. What would you expect from a wife, she asked. A partner, he said without a second's thought. Someone to help run the place. Can you handle that? I kept the books for my father's store, Clara said. I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Mercer. Jonah, he said, if we are doing this, you ought to call me Jonah. Then you should call me Clara. Why now? Clara asked. Why look for a bride this way? Jonah looked out the window for a moment. My foreman said I was getting too set in my ways. He suggested the bride platform. And truth be told, I was late getting here. A small smile touched his lips. I figured I would let the other men pick the young, pretty ones. I thought the women left behind would be the ones who already knew how to handle disappointment. That is a cold way to look at it, she said. It is an honest way, he replied. I am not offering you a grand romance, Clara. I am offering you a home, respect, and a purpose. In return, I am asking for a partner. She met his gaze. I stopped believing in romance a long time ago, Jonah. I am looking for exactly what you are offering. They walked down Main Street with the landlady trailing 10 paces behind them. Everyone they passed stopped to stare and whisper about the big rancher and the plain woman he had chosen. Clara kept her head held high. Jonah tucked her hand into his arm. Pay them no mind, he said quietly. Small-town folks will always talk. He led her into the general store. James, he said to the man behind the counter. This is Clara Whitmore. We are courting. He then turned to Clara. We need to get you some good walking boots, some work gloves, and a proper hat. The sun out on the ranch is no joke. In that moment, Clara felt a shift inside her. It was not love, not yet, but it was care, it was a partnership. And for her, that was more than enough. Jonah did not ask, he simply started gearing her up for ranch life, calling it a practical investment. When Clara tried to protest the expense, he just handed her a pair of well-made leather boots. They fit like they were made for her feet. He then told the clerk to add a heavy coat, saying the winters out here were no joke. He looked her square in the eye and then asked if getting proper gear was too much for the woman who might be his wife. Put that way, Clara found she could not argue. She left the store wearing the new boots, feeling the weight of his confident plans. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, Clara quietly mentioned the town gossip that was sure to follow them. Jonah was not bothered by small-town talk, saying he answered to no one. Clara stopped him right there in the sunlight. She needed him to understand she had made bad choices out of desperation before and would not do it again. She wanted to make a clear-headed decision about whether they truly suited each other. Jonah respected that. All he asked was what she needed from him. Honesty and time, she replied. He agreed on the spot, inviting her to his ranch the next day to see the life for herself. His offer was refreshingly simple. If the life was not for her, they would shake hands and part ways with no hard feelings. Clara knew just how rare that kind of straight dealing was in a man. As they walked, he introduced her to folks with a simple, "This is Clara Whitmore," ignoring the surprised looks and judgmental stares. He told her people were just thinking he chose a grown woman instead of a young girl. But he was certain that in 6 months, after she was running his home, they would all be singing a different tune. Clara had never known a man with so much faith in her. Clara, have you ever been told you were too much, only to make yourself smaller and smaller just to fit in? That was Clara Whitmore's life story. But Jonah Mercer just offered her something different, a real partnership. He told her, I need a wife who will speak her mind, who will tell me when I am being a fool. This story is about finding the courage to take up space. So what would you do if someone finally asked you to be yourself? Jonah was about to leave. Tomorrow at 8, he said, I will bring you a horse. Claire admitted it had been years since she rode. He just smiled. It will come back to you. Then he got serious. Clara, I want you to think about building a life with me, not just keeping house, but a true partnership. She thought of all the times she had silenced herself to be more acceptable. I do not know, she said. I have spent so long trying to be smaller, I am not sure how to be big again. Jonah put on his hat. Then maybe it is time you learned. I will see you in the morning. Later, Mrs. Brennan told her, that man is serious about you. I have known Jonah Mercer for 10 years, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Clara asked how he looked at her. Mrs. Brennan smiled, like you are someone worth fighting for. That night, Clara could not sleep. The other women in the boarding house were thrilled with their own courtships, so sure of their happy endings. Clara did not feel sure at all. Life had taught her that certainty was a trick, but Jonah had not offered fairy tales. He offered honesty and a choice that felt more real than any romantic promise. She tried to picture herself as Mrs. Jonah Mercer, living on a ranch, no longer invisible or waiting for rejection. The hope felt like a foreign language she had forgotten how to speak. The next morning was clear and cold. Clara dressed in her new riding clothes and boots. Looking in the mirror, she saw a capable woman, someone who belonged on a frontier ranch. Jonah arrived at exactly 8 with 2 horses. One was a gentle chestnut mare named Rosie. She is even-tempered, he said, helping Clara into the saddle. Her muscles protested, but Jonah was patient. Just breathe, he told her. Let your body remember. They rode north into wide-open country. The sky was so vast it made Clara feel tiny, but also part of something enormous. It is beautiful, Jonah said. And terrifying, Clara answered. A person could get lost out here. Or a person could finally have room to breathe, Jonah replied. As they rode, he pointed out landmarks and explained the rhythm of the ranch. He told her about the challenges, the hard work, and the tough decisions. I would expect you to have an opinion worth hearing, he said. My first wife, Catherine, just nodded and agreed with everything. It meant I was making decisions without all the information. Then they crested a hill, and the ranch spread out below them. A large white house stood surrounded by barns and corrals. It was a whole community. That is home, Jonah said simply. For Clara, the word felt like a distant memory. She had not had a real home since her father died, and she was left with nothing but $17. Down in the ranch yard, a weathered man in his 50s with sharp blue eyes walked up to them. Clara, this is my foreman, Sam Hastings, Jonah said. Sam, this is Clara Whitmore. We are courting. Sam's face cracked into a grin. About damn time, boss. Pardon me, miss. Clara smiled. Plain speaking needs no pardon. Sam looked at Jonah. She will do. Then he asked Clara, you cook? She said yes. Good. Cookie has been threatening to quit over the lack of spice. Jonah then guided Clara toward the house. It was large and clean, but felt impersonal, like a place where someone once lived but left no mark. Catherine decorated, Jonah explained. Most of her things are packed away. I would expect you to make this place your own. Clara ran a hand over the empty mantelpiece, imagining a home filled with warmth, a home that was finally hers. This ranch is a good house, solid and lonely. It hasn't. Strong, quiet, he stated plainly. It hadn't felt like home since his wife passed. He hoped a good woman could make it feel that way again. The rest of the day was spent diving deep into ranch life. Clara had felt like home since Catherine passed. Jonah hopes a good woman can change that. He spent the whole day showing Clara the ropes of ranch life. She met his 30 ranch hands, men of all ages. Most were respectful, though met all the ranch hands, about 30 men of different ages. Most were polite but curious. A few openly doubted the plain woman their boss was dating. She watched them work the cattle, learned about raising horses, and listened in on a talk about which fields needed to rest over winter. Jonah included her in everything. He asked her thoughts even when she didn't have any. This pushed her to be part of it, not just watch from the sidelines. At lunchtime, they ate Mrs. Brennan's packed lunch. They sat on a fence post, looking out over the south pasture. Jonah talked about Catherine, not hiding the hard times, but not holding on to anger either. Clara found herself opening up about things she usually curious. A few clearly doubted this plain woman their boss was seeing. Clara watched them work cattle, learned about breeding horses, and even sat in on a talk about which fields to let rest over winter. Jonah made sure to include her in everything kept private. Her dad's business going under, her mom dying when Clara was 12, the string of losses that had led her to 7 online dating sites and 7 rejections. You could have given up, Jonah said. After the second or third time, you could have just quit trying. And do what? Clara countered. Work myself to death in some city factory? End up with nothing? Clara shook her head. At least this way I kept reaching. He'd ask her thoughts even when she had no idea what to say. This made her feel part of things, not just a bystander. At midday, they ate Mrs. Brennan's packed lunch, sitting on a fence for something better. That's what I saw in you on that dating site, Jonah said softly. Someone still fighting when most folks would have thrown in the towel. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows, they rode back toward town. Clara's muscles screamed, and she knew tomorrow would be tough. But something inside her felt steadier. The ranch was real, the work was real, and Jonah's offer was exactly as he described. Hard work, a looking out at the south pasture. Jonah talked about Catherine not hiding the hard parts, but not sounding bitter either. Clara found herself opening up about things she usually kept hidden. She spoke of her father's business failing, her mother dying purpose, a true partnership, no fake romance, but no dishonesty either. So, Jonah asked as they neared Dawson Creek, what are your honest thoughts? Clara thought it over carefully. It's more work than I've ever done, more responsibility than I've ever handled, more space than I'm used to right now. But I think I could learn to handle it. I think with time, I could get good at it. That's all when Clara was just 12 and the string of bad luck that led her to 7 online dating sites and 7 rejections. You could have quit, Jonah said, after the second or third time. And do what? Clara asked, masking for. Jonah replied, a willingness to try. They arrived at Mrs. Brennan's boarding house as dusk turned the sky orange and purple. Jonah helped Clara off her horse. He watched her closely as her stiff muscles made her stumble. Tomorrow's Sunday, he said. Church services in the morning, then a community supper afterward. I'll pick you up at 9 if that works. Church? Clara hadn't gone to services. Work myself to death in some city factory? End up with nothing? She shook her head. At least this way, I kept trying for something better. That's what I saw in you, Jonah said softly in years. She'd lost her faith somewhere between her third and fourth rejection. Folks will expect it, Jonah explained. It's a good way for them to see us together. To start getting used to the idea. He paused. Unless it bothers you. No, Clara said. I'll manage. He smiled then, a genuine smile that changed his face from stern to quite handsome. You'll do more than manage, Clara, on that platform. Someone's still fighting when most would have given up. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows, they rode back toward town. Clara's muscles screamed, and she knew tomorrow would be tough. But deep down, something felt. I'm starting to think you'll surprise us both. He rode off, and Clara climbed the boarding house steps feeling like she'd just finished a race and wasn't sure if she'd won or lost. Emma met her at the door, full of questions, but Clara pleaded exhaustion and went straight to her room. Alone at last, she took off her boots and rubbed her sore feet, thinking about everything she'd seen and learned. The ranch was huge, steadier. The ranch was real, the work was real, and Jonah's offer was just as he'd described. Hard work, a purpose, and a true partnership. No fake romance, no lies. Well, Jonah asked, the work was never-ending. The responsibility was immense. Jonah was exactly as he'd presented himself. Hard-working, honest, looking for a partner, not someone to boss around. Could she do this? Could she truly step into that life and make it her own? The alternative is worse, her own words echoed back. What was the alternative, really? Another dating site, another rejection, another slow slide into poverty and being overlooked? Or taking this chance? This as they neared Dawson Creek. Honest thoughts, Clara thought carefully. It's more work than I've ever done, she finally said. More responsibility than I've ever had, and more space than I'm used to unlikely chance. And seeing if she could build something real from the wreckage of 7 failures. Clara looked at her reflection in the darkening window. A woman in riding clothes, her hair coming loose from its braid, her face tanned and alive in a way it hadn't been in years. She looked like someone who'd spent a point doing real work, like someone who belonged somewhere, like someone who might actually have a future. The thought was scary, but standing there in the dim too. But I think I could learn to handle it. I think with time I could get good at it. That's all I'm asking for, a chance to try. They arrived at Mrs. Brennan's Ming Light. Clara made her choice, not out of desperation, not because Jonah Mercer was her last hope, but because for the first time in 7 years, someone had looked at her and seen strength, not failure. He'd offered her a partnership, not pity. He'd given her room to grow instead of demanding she shrink to fit someone else's mold. She would court him properly, give it the whole week, be completely honest, and put in real effort. And boarding house as the sky turned shades of orange and purple. Jonah helped Clara off her horse. He watched her closely as her stiff muscles made her stumble. Tomorrow's Sunday, he said. Church in the morning, then a community at the end. She would say yes. Not to being rescued, but to building something together. To becoming the woman she'd almost forgotten she could be. To finally being chosen for exactly who she was. Sunday morning arrived with church bells ringing all over Dawson Creek. Their sound drifted through Clara's open window, pulling her from dreams of wide-open grasslands and stormy gray eyes. She dressed with special care, knowing that today she would face the whole town as Jonah dinner. I'll pick you up at 9 if that works. Church? Clara hadn't been to church in years. She'd lost her faith somewhere between her 3rd and 4th dating rejection. People will expect it, Jonah explained. Mercer's chosen woman. The attention would be intense. The judgment would be quick. And there would be no escaping the whispers that followed a 31-year-old single woman who had somehow captured the territory's most eligible. It's a good way for them to see us together. To start accepting the idea. He paused. Unless it makes you uncomfortable. No, Clara replied. I'll manage. He smiled then, a genuine smile that softened widower. Her hands shook as she pinned up her hair. She forced them steady through sheer will. Jonah was drawn into conversations about ranch business and town politics. These were matters Clara didn't understand yet, but she knew she'd need to learn them. She found herself standing awkwardly at the edge of groups, not fully in, but not completely out either. She occupied that uncomfortable space of someone not yet accepted. Don't let them get to you, a voice said from behind her, his stern face. You'll do more than manage, Clara. I'm starting to think you'll surprise us both. He rode off, and Clara climbed the boarding house steps. She felt like she'd just run a race, and it was Beth, one of the married women from the boarding house. Her sad eyes were kind. They're testing you, seeing if you'll break under the pressure. Clara asked, was it like this for Catherine? Beth wasn't sure if she'd won or lost. Emma rushed to meet her at the door, full of questions. But Clara, feeling worn out, just wanted to get to her room. Alone, she kicked off her boots and rubbed her hesitated, then nodded. Worse, actually. She was so young, so overwhelmed by it all. They sensed weakness and swarmed like wolves. By the end, she hardly left the ranch because facing town was too painful. And they think I'll do the same? Clara asked. Some do, Beth replied. Others figure you're tougher since you've already been through so much. Beth looked Clara over carefully. Which one are you? The aching feet, replaying everything she'd seen and learned. The ranch was huge, the work unending, the responsibility immense. Jonah was exactly as he'd presented himself. Tough, honest, looking for a partner. Not someone to boss woman who will fold, or the one who will prove them all wrong. Clara thought about the 7 dating sites, the 7 rejections, the 7 times she'd picked herself back up and tried again. She thought about the other option, the around. Could she really do this? Could she step into that life and make it her own? Her own words echoed back. The alternative is worse. What was the alternative, really? Another dating site, another rejection. A slow slide, slow dying of hope, purpose, and dignity. She thought about Jonah's offer of partnership, of being seen as strong, not broken. I'm the woman who doesn't fold, she said quietly. I can't afford to. Beth smiled, the first real warmth Clara had felt from anyone besides Emma. Then you'll do just fine. Give it 6 months. By spring, half these women will be asking your advice on running into poverty and being forgotten, or taking this chance, this unlikely chance, and seeing if she could build something real from the wreckage of 7 failures. Clara looked at her reflection in the darkening window. She saw a woman in riding clothes, her braid household, and the other half will be telling everyone they knew you were perfect for Jonah all along. The afternoon crawled by. Clara felt her composure weakening with each whispered comment, each searching glance, each barely hidden judgment. When Jonah finally suggested they take a walk, she almost sagged with relief. They left the church grounds and headed toward the edge of town, where buildings gave way to open land. The autumn air was cool and fresh, smelling of wood smoke and distant rain. Clara breathed deeply, letting the open coming undone, her face sun-kissed and alive in a way it hadn't been for years. She looked like someone who had spent a day doing real work, like someone who belonged somewhere, like someone who might actually have a future. The space and quiet washed away some of the tension in her chest. That was rough, Jonah said after they walked in silence for a few minutes. Worse than I thought it would be. Is it always like this? No, Jonah replied. Usually people mind their own business better. But we're the biggest news this town's had in months, so everyone feels like they've got a right to an opinion. He stopped walking and turned to face her. Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Her stomach tightened. Okay? Can you handle this, he asked. Not just today, but long term, because this is part thought was scary. But standing there in the fading light, Clara made her choice. Not out of desperation, not because Jonah Mercer was her last hope, but because for the first time in 7 years, someone had looked at her and seen the strength of the life I'm offering. Small-town politics, gossip, people who will judge you for not being what they expected. It doesn't matter to me. I know my own mind and I stand by my choices. But not failure. He had offered partnership, not pity. He had given her room to grow instead of expecting her to shrink to fit his expectations. She would court him properly, give it a full week, be completely honest, and make it will matter to you, having to face this every time we come to town. Clara considered lying, putting on a brave face and pretending the day hadn't shaken her. But Jonah had asked for honesty, and she owed him that much. It's harder than I expected, she admitted. I thought I was past caring what people thought of me. Turns out, I'm not as tough as I believed. That's not weakness. That's just a real effort. At the end, she would say yes, not to being rescued, but to building something together, to becoming the woman she'd almost forgotten she could be, to finally, truly being chosen for exactly who she was. Sunday being human. But can I handle it long term? Clara looked out over the grassland, stretching toward the distant mountains. I don't know. I want to say yes, that I'll grow a thicker skin and stop caring. But honestly, morning arrived with church bells ringing all over Dawson Creek. Their sound drifted through Clara's open window, pulling her from dreams of wide-open grasslands and storm-gray eyes. She dressed with extra care, knowing she would face the whole "I'm not sure." I've spent so long being invisible that being visible feels like standing naked in a town square. Jonah was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. Town today is Jonah Mercer's chosen woman. The stares would be intense, the judgments quick, and there would be no escaping the whispers that followed a 31-year-old spinster who had somehow captured the territory's most eligible widower. Her hands shook as she pinned up her hair, and she forced them steady with pure determination. Jonah was drawn into conversations about ranch business and local politics, topics Clara didn't yet understand but knew she'd need to learn. She found herself standing awkwardly at the edge of groups, not fully in or completely out, stuck in that uncomfortable space of someone not yet accepted. Don't let them get to you, a voice said from behind her. It was Beth, one of the married women from the boarding house. Her sad eyes were kind. They're testing you, seeing if you'll break under pressure. Clara asked, Is this what Catherine went through? Beth hesitated, then nodded. Worse, actually. She was so young, so overwhelmed by everything. They sensed weakness and acted like wolves. By the end, she hardly left the ranch because facing town was too painful. "And they think I'll do the same?" Clara asked. "Some do," Beth replied. "Others figure you're tougher since you have already survived so much." Beth looked Clara over carefully. "Which are you? The one who will crumble or the one who will prove them all wrong?" Clara thought about 7 dating sites, 7 rejections, 7 times she'd picked herself up and tried again. She thought about the other option, the slow death of hope, purpose, and dignity. She thought about Jonah's offer of partnership, of being seen as strong, not broken. "I'm the woman who doesn't crumble," she said quietly. "I can't afford to." Beth smiled, the first real warmth Clara had felt from anyone besides Emma. "Then you'll do just fine. Give it 6 months. By spring, half these women will be asking your advice on running a household, and the other half will be telling everyone they knew you were perfect for Jonah all along." The afternoon dragged on, and Clara felt her composure wearing thin with each whispered comment, each speculative glance, each barely hidden judgment. When Jonah finally suggested they take a walk, she almost sagged with relief. They left the churchyard and walked toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land. The autumn air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and distant rain. Clara breathed deeply, letting the space and quiet wash away some of the tension in her chest. "That was tough," Jonah said, after they'd walked in silence for several minutes. "Worse than I expected. Is it always like this?" "No," he replied. "Usually people mind their own business better. But we're the biggest news this town has had in months, so everyone feels entitled to an opinion." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." Her stomach tightened. "Okay. Can you handle this, not just today, but long term? Because this is part of the life I'm offering. Small town politics, gossip, of people judging you for not being what they expected. It doesn't matter to me. I know my own mind, and I stand by my choices. But it'll matter to you, having to face this every time we come to town." Clara considered lying, putting on a brave face and pretending the day hadn't shaken her. But Jonah had asked for honesty, and she owed him that much. "It's harder than I expected," she admitted. "I thought I was past caring what people thought of me. Turns out I'm not as tough as I believed." "That's not weakness. That's being human. But can I handle it long term?" Clara looked out over the grasslands stretching toward distant mountains. "I don't know. I want to say yes, that I'll develop thicker skin and stop caring. But honestly, I'm not sure. I've spent so long being invisible that being visible feels like standing naked in a town square." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. As Dawson Creek came into view, Jonah asked for her honest thoughts. Clara confessed it was more work and responsibility than she'd ever known. Still, she believed she could learn to manage it all. That willingness was all he asked. They arrived at Mrs. Brennan's at dusk, and Jonah helped her down. He told her about the church service and community dinner the next day, offering to call for her at 9 o'clock. When Clara hesitated about church, he explained it was a good way for folks to see them together. He smiled a real smile then, saying he thought she would do more than just manage. As he rode off, Clara wondered if she'd won or lost this race she was running. Clara looked at her reflection in the dark window. She saw a woman who looked like she belonged somewhere, like she had a future. That thought was terrifying, but it was also freeing. For the first time in 7 years, someone saw strength in her, not failure. Jonah had offered a partnership, not pity. She decided right then she would give this courtship an honest try. She would say yes, not to be rescued, but to build something real. On Sunday morning, she dressed with care, ready to face the town as Jonah Mercer's choice. She knew the gossip would be fierce for a 31-year-old spinster landing the territory's most eligible man. Clara knew this town was judging her, but she had weathered far worse storms than idle gossip. A young woman named Emma entered, her face alight with excitement. "Oh, Miss Clara, that dress is lovely. You already look like a rancher's wife." Clara looked down at her plain dark green cotton dress. "It is just an old thing," she replied. Emma's smile fell. "Some folks are being unkind. Mrs. Patterson said Mr. Mercer must be losing his mind to choose someone so plain." Clara sighed. "It is all right, Emma. I know who I am." But Emma fiercely defended her. Those silly women wouldn't last a day on that ranch. You will build something real. Anyone can see it. Just then, a voice called from downstairs. Jonah had arrived. Clara took a deep breath and went to face the day. Jonah stood in the parlor, looking stoic in a dark suit. A flicker of approval crossed his eyes. "You look well," he said. The walk to church was a trial, with eyes staring from every window. The whispers were like a heavy fog. Jonah, however, seemed completely untroubled. "How do you ignore them?" Clara asked. "I do not ignore them," Jonah said quietly. "I just care more about what I know is true." The church went silent as they entered. Every single head turned to stare. Clara felt her face burn, but she kept her chin high as Jonah led her to a pew near the front. The whispers started again, like rustling leaves. "What is he thinking? She is so old." Clara focused on the simple altar, trying to match Jonah's granite composure through the long service. When the service ended, Clara just wanted to hide, but Jonah led her outside to the community dinner under the oak trees. A sharp voice cut through the noise. "Jonah, a word." A handsome, wealthy-looking woman named Margaret Hastings approached, her eyes sweeping over Clara with pure disdain. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said, her smile cold as ice. "We are all so fascinated by your situation." Clara simply nodded. "Mrs. Hastings," Margaret's voice dripped with false sweetness, "you must tell me how you captured Jonah's attention. So many lovely young women have tried, and then you arrive, and it is all settled. It is quite a thing." "Margaret," Jonah's voice held a clear warning. "I am just curious," she insisted. "You could have any woman in the territory, and instead you choose." Her eyes sized up Clara's every flaw. Before Clara could respond, Jonah stepped between them. His voice was low but carried like a crack of thunder. "I chose a woman, Margaret, not a girl playing dress-up. I chose a partner with a strong backbone, not someone looking for an easy life on my land." Margaret's face turned bright red. "I did not mean to imply—" "Yes, you did," Jonah cut in. "And let me be plain. Any disrespect to Clara is disrespect to me. She is going to be my wife. I suggest you get used to it." The silence was deafening. Margaret gave a stiff nod and hurried away. The meal was tense. Women at their table asked Clara pointed questions, trying to catch her off guard. "Do you know how to manage a large household?" one asked. "I know how to manage what I have." "Are you not worried about the isolation?" another pressed. "I enjoy my own company." Clara barely ate, fighting the urge to tell them all what she thought. Jonah leaned in, his voice for her alone. "You are doing just fine. I do not know how you have stood this for 4 years," she whispered back. "I mostly avoided town," he admitted with a slight smile. "It is one of the reasons I need a wife, to be my social shield." Despite it all, Clara nearly smiled back. "You think I can handle it?" she asked, looking at the judgmental faces around them. "I can handle anything if it means I never have to be grateful for scraps again." Jonah was busy with ranch talk, leaving Clara feeling like an outsider. A woman named Beth quietly told her, "Don't let them intimidate you. They're just testing you." Beth explained that Jonah's first wife, Catherine, had been overwhelmed by the pressure, and the town's women had circled like wolves. They wondered if Clara would break too. Clara thought about her 7 rejections and the slow loss of hope. She thought about Jonah's offer of a partnership. "I'm the woman who doesn't fold," she said softly. Beth smiled warmly. "Then you'll do just fine," she promised. When Jonah finally suggested a walk, Clara was relieved to escape the churchyard. The crisp autumn air helped calm her nerves. "That was brutal," Jonah said after a long silence. He turned to her, waiting to ask if she could handle this kind of life. He needed her to be honest. Clara admitted it was harder than she'd expected, that she wasn't as tough as she'd thought. It felt like standing exposed in a town square. "That's not weakness," Jonah said gently. "That's just being human." He told her he respected her honesty more than any brave lies she could have told. He spoke with a quiet certainty. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you. Not a mistake, not a consolation prize, and sure as heck not some woman who ought to be grateful for a glance." His voice was like solid rock. "I see a woman who keeps getting knocked down but always gets right back up. I see someone who speaks the truth, even when it's hard. I see a woman with the grit to face down a whole church full of judging eyes and not back down. You are stronger than Catherine ever was, stronger than most folks I know. Her throat felt tight. You don't even know me. I know enough. And Clara, here's the plain truth. I ain't offering you this life out of pity. I'm offering a partnership because I think we can build something real. But you have to want it. You have to be willing to stand by me and let our actions tell those folks where to go. If you ain't up for it, just say so. No harm, no foul. I won't drag you into a life that'll make you miserable. But I don't figure you're the kind to run from a fight. I think you're just stubborn enough to prove every last one of them wrong. Something inside her shifted. That anger turned hard as a diamond. He was right. She was furious at being judged by people who knew nothing about her 7 rejections, about her struggles. So you're asking for a fight, she said. I'm asking you to hold your ground. There's a difference. And you'll stand with me? When they whisper that I'm not good enough? Jonah's voice was steady as stone. I don't give a damn what they think. I care about what we can build together. The rest of it is just noise. She looked at this man who saw a fighter where everyone else saw a failure. A fire lit in her belly, a need to prove him right. All right, Jonah, she said, I'll hold my ground. I'll face their judgment and prove I belong right by your side. But you have to promise me something, name it. If I start to fail, if I'm not cut out for this, you tell me straight. No pity, agreed. And that goes for you too. If this life makes you miserable, you tell me. No suffering in silence. They shook hands on it. The calluses on his palm felt more binding than any sweet promise. This was their foundation. Honesty and hard truths. As they walked back to town, the sky blazed with sunset colors. People were leaving the church gathering. They still stared, but this time, Clara met their gaze head on. Let them whisper. She wasn't going anywhere. At her boarding house, Jonah tipped his hat. Tomorrow, I'm riding to the North Pasture. It's a full day's ride. But on Tuesday, I want you back at the ranch. You can work with Cookie in the kitchen, get the lay of the land. Can you do that? Yes, he looked her square in the eye. Clara, after all that today, are you still in? She saw real concern in his gaze, and it steadied her. I'm still in, she said. Are you? More certain than ever. Get some rest. Tuesday will be a long day. In her room, Emma was waiting, knowing the townswomen had been cruel. They were awful to you, weren't they? The girl's eyes filled with tears. I heard Mrs. Patterson say Mr. Mercer must be going soft in the head. It's not fine, Emma declared fiercely. You're exactly what he needs, and they're just jealous. Clara had to smile at the girl's loyalty. Maybe so, but their jealousy is their problem, not mine. I have bigger things to worry about. Like what? Like learning to run a ranch? Like building something real with a man I barely know? She sat on her bed, feeling the weight of it all, like seeing if I'm brave enough to grab this chance instead of sabotaging it myself. Emma took her hand. Miss Clara, you are brave enough. You proved it by trying 7 times. Most folks quit after 1. That night, Clara thought about the difference between just surviving and truly living. For 7 years, she had been surviving. Jonah was asking her to live, to take up space and matter. The question was, could she do it? The next day passed under a cloud of whispers as she walked through town. Clara held her head high, but every stare felt like a small cut. That evening, a knock came. It was Margaret Hastings, her face tight but no longer hateful. May I have a word? She asked, stiff as a board. Clara let her in. I owe you an apology, Margaret said at last. My behavior was inexcusable. Sam read me the riot act over it last night. I see. The truth is, she struggled to say, I had hopes for my niece, Sarah. When Jonah chose you instead, I was insulted on her behalf. At least she was honest. But Sam reminded me Jonah doesn't need another pretty face. He needs someone capable and strong. And Sam says you've already shown more grit in 2 days than most women do in 2 months. Clara wasn't sure what to say to that. I am not asking us to be friends, Margaret went on, but this is a small town. Our families depend on each other. I would prefer to start over. Clara looked at the proud woman who was swallowing her pride to make things right. It was a clumsy apology, but it was honest. I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. Hastings. I am willing to start fresh if you are. Relief washed over Margaret's face. Thank you. And please, call me Margaret. On Tuesday morning, they rode out to the ranch. There, a grizzled old cook named Cookie looked Clara up and down. "So you're the one," he grumbled. "You cook?" Clara said she could, though not on this scale. He pointed to a massive workspace. "Prove it," he ordered. "Make biscuits for 30 men." Without a word, Clara rolled up her sleeves, her hands moved with an old, familiar confidence, shaping the dough with quick skill. As she worked in the well-supplied kitchen, she felt a flicker of competence she had not felt in years, knowing the old man's critical eyes were watching her every move. At the ranch, the crusty old cook, Cookie, tested her by having her make biscuits. After one bite, he gave a single gruff nod. "You'll do," he said, before asking if she could handle a stew for 30 hungry men. She could. At noon, the cowboys filled the dining hall, and they were all polite and respectful. Jonah sat at the head of the table watching her. When she refilled his coffee, he gently caught her hand. "They're relaxed around you," he said quietly. "That matters." Later, he gave her a tour of the barns and explained the horse breeding operation that was his pride and joy. Jonah admitted his first wife, Catherine, never cared for the ranch, but his ranch was his life. He needed a true partner, someone who would be a part of it all. Looking at the passion in his eyes, Clara knew she wanted to try. In the quiet dimness of the barn, a strange calm settled over her. She told him right then that when he asked formally at the end of the week, her answer would be yes. He stood very still for a moment. Then he reached out, cupped her face in his work-roughened hand, and made her a promise. He said, "Clara Whitmore, I will never take you for granted." Have you ever been made to feel worthless? Well, Clara had felt that way her whole life, until a rancher named Jonah made her an offer that changed everything. This is a story about finding your own value, and if you've ever cheered for the underdog, you'll want to hear this. Jonah looked at her and said, "You are my full partner, and I will stand beside you against anyone. You have my word." For Clara, that was all she had ever wanted. A week later, this man would be her husband. The thought was no longer terrifying. Back at her boarding house, Jonah helped her down from her horse. "Tomorrow, see Doc Hadley. Then we'll visit the Reverend. On Friday," he paused, "I'll ask you properly. If you still say yes, we'll marry Saturday." In 5 days, everything would change. Clara's friend Emma was overjoyed. "It's a fairy tale," she cried. "It's a practical arrangement," Clara insisted. But Emma just smiled. "I see the way he looks at you when you are not watching. That is not just practical." Clara fell asleep thinking of Jonah's promise to never make her feel small. It was more than enough. It was everything. The next morning was gray and drizzly. At Dr. Hadley's office, the air was thick with the smell of whiskey. "So you're Mercer's bride-to-be," the doctor said, his hands shaking a bit. Caused quite a stir. That choice did. He began his examination, his stethoscope cold against her skin. "Ranching is hard on women," Dr. Hadley mumbled. "Catherine Mercer, she was not built for it. Too delicate, it broke her down piece by piece." Clara's hands tightened in her lap. "I am not Catherine." The doctor looked at her over his spectacles. "No, you are not. And my advice to you is this. Do not try to be her. Be exactly who you are. That is what he needs." The words hit her hard. Later, she met Jonah at the church. The Reverend Matthews was gentle but direct. "Mr. Mercer, you have known Miss Whitmore less than a week. Are you certain this is not a hasty decision?" Jonah's jaw was tight, but his voice was steady. "Reverend, I spent 4 years alone to avoid a hasty choice. I know what I want in a partner, and Clara is that woman." The Reverend turned to Clara. "And you, Miss Whitmore, you are content with this?" Clara met his gaze. "I have been alone for 7 years, Reverend. This way I will have a purpose and a partnership." The Reverend sighed and nodded. "Very well, the ceremony will be Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Jonah guided her under a large oak tree. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "It is just reality setting in," she confessed. "It feels like so much to handle." "Then we will handle it together," Jonah said, his voice a comfort. "I am not expecting perfection. I am expecting honesty. That is what partnership means." She looked at his sincere face and had to ask, "How do you have so much faith in someone you barely know?" He replied, "Because I have watched you this week. I have seen your character. I have seen your strength. You need to stop waiting for failure, Clara. This is different. We are building something new." A carriage splashing through a puddle broke the moment. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you home. Tomorrow we will ride." Saturday, he'd said, "We start our life together." That evening, Clara was helping in the kitchen when Emma rushed in, her eyes wide. "Miss Clara, some ladies are here to see you." In the parlor sat the most powerful women in Dawson Creek, the same ones who'd stared at her in church. Clara braced herself for more judgment, but Mrs. Patterson stood up and smiled. "We've come to help with the wedding plans," she said. "We know there isn't much time." The women had brought packages and bolts of fabric. They said simple was one thing, but unprepared was another. "You need a proper dress," one of them insisted. In that moment, Clara realized this was more than just a marriage. It was a brand new life. Later, three of the most important ranch wives in Dawson Creek paid Clara a visit. They came bearing a gift, a lovely dress of cream-colored silk. "This was my wedding dress," one of them said softly. "You need it now." Another, Mrs. Patterson spoke plainly. "Clara, we admit we were doubtful when Jonah picked you, but we have been watching you this week. We have seen how you carry yourself with dignity, even when folks are unkind." Jonah knew what he was doing. "Out here, ranch wives have to rely on each other to survive. We want you to be one of us." Clara watched the very women who had judged her so harshly now offering help. Their acceptance felt tentative, like they were still sizing her up. But it was a start. It was a chance. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'd be honored to wear your dress, Mrs. Whitfield." They stayed a while, planning the simple wedding. Talk eventually turned to the hard realities of ranch life, and Clara listened, soaking it all in. Later, Emma helped her try on the dress. It fit like a dream. "You look beautiful," Emma whispered. "Mr. Mercer won't be able to look away." Clara just shook her head. "It's a symbol, Emma, a new beginning." As Emma adjusted the lace, she asked quietly, "Are you scared about being with a man you barely know?" Clara had been trying to ignore that very thought. "Terrified," she admitted, "but Jonah has been honest. He's not promising a grand romance." Emma smiled. "My mama always said the best love grows from respect." A comfortable partnership would be more than Clara had ever hoped for. The next day, Jonah arrived early for their ride. He showed her the boundaries of his land, explaining how they moved the cattle with the seasons. "This creek is the northern edge," he said, pointing past the bubbling water. "How many cattle do you have?" she asked, her riding muscles feeling stronger. "About 3,000 head," he answered. "I aim for quality, not just quantity. Keeps the land healthy." They ate by the creek, and Jonah spoke of his vision for the ranch. He was building an empire stone by stone. "You need to understand all this," Jonah said, his gaze sweeping across the vast land. "If anything ever happens to me, you have to be able to work with awhile and keep this place running." His practicality was startling. "You're already planning for your death?" "I'm planning for life out here," he corrected gently. "It's a hard country. A man has to be realistic. I love my first wife, Catherine, but I didn't prepare her for the truth of this place. I won't make that mistake twice." He explained they would be partners, two whole people, strong on their own, but stronger together. It was a different kind of marriage, one built on capability, not just feeling. "I like that," Clara said. "I've spent too long feeling like half a person." "That's what I want," Jonah said. "Both of us whole, both of us strong." They rode on to the eastern hills, where he pointed out a small line shack. "Cowboys use it during roundup," he explained. "Sometimes in a storm, a place like that can save a man's life." "You still ride in the roundup?" she asked. "Every single year. A man can't lead if he ain't willing to do the work." He looked at her then, his eyes serious. Catherine hated it. She complained, but she never once worried. There's a difference. As they returned to the ranch, Sam met them in the yard. He told Jonah, "She's getting stronger in the saddle." Then he turned to Clara. "My wife Margaret would like you to join us for supper tomorrow, to make things right." The invitation could be an olive branch or another test. "I'm willing," Clara replied. That night, she couldn't settle down. Dinner with the Hastings tomorrow, and her wedding the day after. In 48 hours, everything would change. Needing air, she walked through the quiet town and found herself drawn to the little church. She slipped inside, sitting in the back pew, letting all the fear and hope wash over her. "Figured I might find you here." Clara turned to see Jonah in the doorway. He sat beside her in the quiet dark. "How did you know?" she asked. "Mrs. Brennan said you went walking. Seemed like you might need a quiet place." He studied her face. "Second thoughts?" "I'm terrified, Jonah," she whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. "Not of you, but of all of it." Sitting beside Jonah in the quiet church, Clara finally told him the truth. "I am not afraid of you," she said, her voice low. "I am afraid of failing you, of proving everyone right who said you made a terrible mistake." Jonah surprised her by admitting, "I am terrified too. I am scared of repeating the mistakes I made with my first wife, Catherine. She was so lonely, and I did not see it until it was too late." He took her hand, his grip firm. "I need you to promise me one thing. Promise you will tell me when you are struggling." Looking at him, Clara realized they were just two scared people hoping for a second chance. "I can promise honesty," she said. "That is all I ask," he answered. Jonah laid it out plain and simple. "Clara, if you still say yes tomorrow, then on Saturday we'll stand before Reverend Schwartz. You'll become my wife, and I'll be your husband. If you say no, I'll respect it and wish you well. No hard feelings." He walked her back to the boarding house under the quiet stars. At her door, he paused. "Whatever you decide, thank you. You've reminded me how to look forward." Inside, young Emma was waiting, full of worry. "Miss Clara, where have you been?" Clara sank into a chair. "Just thinking, Emma, wondering if I'm grabbing at security or making a real choice." Emma took her hands, her face serious. "Can I tell you what I see? I see a woman who keeps getting back up no matter how many times she's knocked down. And I see the way Mr. Mercer looks at you, like you're the most important person in the world. That ain't desperation, Miss Clara. That's courage." Hearing that gave Clara the strength she needed. Lying in bed that night, she realized the choice was already made. It was not about fear or having no other options. It was about Jonah Mercer. He offered her a real partnership, respect, and a chance to finally matter. After 7 years of being invisible, of being passed over and forgotten, it was time to be seen. It was time to choose a life where she belonged. When Jonah asked tomorrow, her answer would be yes. For the first time in 7 long years, Clara fell asleep without a single fear and with a peaceful certainty in her heart. She would be a bride on Saturday. Clara felt a deep calm on that golden autumn morning. The town was buzzing with gossip, but her path was set. Tonight, Jonah would formally ask for her hand, and tomorrow they would be married. She chose her dress with care, knowing the evening was more than just a formality. Her friend Emma was a bundle of nerves for her. "A real proposal, like in a book. Are you not thrilled?" Emma asked. Clara smiled gently. "I am content and hopeful. That feels more solid than thrilled." The day moved slowly. She ran errands, feeling the curious eyes of the townsfolk. They all knew the widow Mercer was getting a new wife. At 4 o'clock, Jonah arrived. He looked handsome and nervous. "You look lovely," Jonah said, offering his arm. "You look nervous," she replied with a small smile. He admitted that proposing in front of witnesses was enough to rattle any man. They walked to the Hastings home where Sam and his wife Margaret greeted them. Dinner was pleasant, filled with safe talk of ranching and winter preparations. Sam told stories of the early days, of how Jonah had built his ranch from nothing with his own 2 hands. "Worked himself near to death," Sam said. "And yet here I am." "And," Jonah noted dryly. Margaret added quietly, "That is because Catherine made you slow down." A sudden tension filled the room at the mention of Jonah's first wife. "It is true," Jonah said, his voice low. "Catherine helped me build a life, not just a ranch." Margaret watched Clara, her eyes assessing. Sam then spoke bluntly. "Clara faces a different challenge. She will be compared to a woman everyone has made into a saint." Margaret gasped, but Clara found her voice. "He is right. People will judge every choice I make against their memory of Catherine." "And how will you handle that?" Margaret asked, her curiosity real. Clara met her gaze. "By being myself. I'm not here to replace his past. I am here to build his future." A slow smile spread across Sam's face. "She will do, boss. She will definitely do." Later, Jonah took her hand in the quiet parlor. He spoke of partnership, respect, and building a new life together. Clara and Jonah stood in the cozy room, the fireplace crackling between them. He looked nervous, which made Clara's own heart start to beat a little faster. He said, Clara, I am not a man who uses pretty words. I am too practical. But you deserve the effort. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Then, to her complete surprise, he got down on one knee. I have watched you this week, he said, his voice steady. I have seen you face judgment with grace. I have seen you work hard and be brave. Choosing you was the best decision I have made in years. I am not offering you an easy life, but a partnership, a man who will respect you and stand by you. Jonah offered a home and a purpose, a chance to build something together. He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a small, beautiful sapphire. Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? After 7 rejections, this man saw her worth. Yes, she said, her voice full of emotion. Yes, I will marry you. Jonah slipped the perfect ring onto her finger. Instead of a kiss, he gently lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Thank you for taking a chance on me, he said. Thank you for seeing me, she whispered. Their loss is my gain, Jonah replied with a small smile. Margaret later gave Clara a warm hug and whispered, I was wrong about you. Be good to him. Walking back to the boarding house, the ring on her finger felt solid and real. Are you nervous about tomorrow? Jonah asked. I was, she said, but now I just feel calm. At the door, he paused. Clara, about tomorrow night, he began softly. I know this is all happening fast. We will take things at whatever pace you need. There is no rush. The kindness in his voice made her chest ache. Thank you for that, she told him. My experience is limited. He squeezed her hand. Mine is too. We will figure it out together. Inside, the other women had a surprise party for her with cake and tea and small, practical gifts. Mrs. Brennan said firmly, You are one of us now. We take care of our own. That night, Clara lay in bed and thought about her journey. She remembered her father's death and the 7 failed attempts to find a new life. Every rejection had felt like the end, but they were just clearing the path that led her to Jonah. She touched the ring on her finger. Thank you, she whispered into the dark. She was grateful for whatever chance had brought them both to that platform at the same time. The next morning, church bells woke her. Today was her wedding day. The women helped her get ready, styling her hair with wildflowers and helping her into a beautiful cream silk dress. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a new woman, one who was strong and ready for the life she had been offered. The church was full of townspeople who came to watch. Clara did not mind their stares. All that mattered was Jonah waiting for her at the altar. He looked handsome in a dark suit, his usual serious face softened by emotion. The Reverend spoke simple words about partnership and building a life together. Clara and Jonah made their promises clearly and honestly. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Jonah gently kissed her. It was their first kiss, soft and full of promise. They signed the marriage certificate, making it all real. Clara wrote her new name for the very first time, Clara Mercer. It looked strange, but it felt right. She belonged somewhere now. The next day, after the simple wedding ceremony, the town offered its congratulations. Margaret Hastings pulled Clara aside and pressed a small, leather-bound journal into her hands. A wedding gift, she said, to record how your new life begins. I judged you wrongly, Clara. You will be a fine partner for Jonah, and I hope we can be friends. I would like that, Clara said, genuinely touched. Soon after, Jonah helped her onto the wagon seat. As they rode toward the ranch, he took her hand. Any second thoughts? He asked. Not a one, she answered. He laced their fingers together. Welcome home, Mrs. Mercer. The ranch was sprawling under the afternoon sun. Cowboys stopped their work to watch the boss arrive with his new wife. Inside the main house, someone had placed wildflowers in vases, and the rooms were spotless. In the bedroom, fresh linens were on the big bed. It is a start, Jonah said, standing beside her. This is your house now, Clara. Your home. Change whatever you wish. The words settled over her like a warm blanket. Home. After 7 long years, she finally had a home. That evening, they ate a quiet dinner together at the large table. Jonah raised his glass. To new beginnings, he said. Clara touched her glass to his. To partnership. On their wedding night, Clara changed into a simple cotton nightgown, her stomach fluttering with nerves. Jonah came into their room and saw the worry plain on her face. He was a big, strong man, and the reality of being his wife hit her all at once. Clara, he said gently, we can take our time. There is no rush. But she surprised herself with her own steady voice. No, we are married. I want us to begin as we mean to continue, as full partners. He walked to her slowly. Then we will go slow. You tell me if you are uncomfortable and we will stop. Understood? He kissed her, and she let herself trust him. It was awkward and tender, two people learning each other. Jonah was patient, always making sure she was comfortable. Clara realized she knew nothing about what it meant to be with a man who truly cared for her. Afterwards, they lay together in the quiet dark, her head on his chest. Are you all right? He whispered, stroking her hair. Yes, she said. Better than all right. Waking before dawn, she looked at the man beside her, this man who had chosen her when no one else would. He had seen strength where others only saw failure. A powerful wave of gratitude washed over her. She was Clara Mercer now. She was home. The first weeks of marriage were a flurry of work and learning. Clara dove into running the household, helping Cookie feed 30 hungry men, and learning the ranch's finances with Jonah each evening. It was not always easy. Some days she felt overwhelmed, and some of the cowboys tested her authority. There were times she felt a pang of loneliness, even surrounded by people. But each time she felt doubt, Clara remembered standing on that platform, being passed over 7 times. She remembered the life she had escaped. Jonah was a true partner, always including her in decisions and treating her as his equal. She was no longer a forgotten woman. She was building a life that mattered. Model. With Jonah, Clara found a partnership built on quiet respect. He supported her work without taking over, and their unease around each other slowly turned into genuine affection. By that winter, she was no longer just the rancher's wife. She was the heart of the Triple Creek Ranch. The entire place ran smoother, and the folks who worked there were happier for it. One snowy February evening, about 8 months after their wedding, Jonah sat her down in the ranch office. His voice was serious. Clara, he said, I need to tell you something important. She looked up, her heart suddenly racing, worried that something was wrong. Nothing is wrong, he assured her. In fact, it is just the opposite. He got up and came around the desk to stand before her. When I chose you on that platform, I figured I was making a practical choice. I needed a capable partner to help run this ranch. Clara held her breath, unsure where he was going with this. But somewhere between watching you stand up for this place and seeing you comfort a homesick cowboy, he continued, his voice soft, I fell in love with you. The words felt bigger than the room. I know that was not part of our agreement, Jonah said quickly, and I am not asking you to feel the same. I just needed you to know. But Clara stood up, her voice shaking but clear. I love you too, she interrupted. You saw me when I felt invisible. How could I not love the man who gave me a home and a purpose? In that moment, as Jonah pulled her close, Clara knew she was finally where she belonged. 8 months earlier, she had been the unwanted woman on a platform. Now she was loved. The following spring, she started something she had dreamed of for months. With ranch money, she opened a small school in an unused building for the children of neighboring ranches. The woman once rejected as an unsuitable teacher was now giving children a chance to learn. Her project was so successful that the community came together to build a proper schoolhouse, with Clara as the permanent teacher. She was no longer just the rancher's wife. She was a pillar of their community. 5 years after that fateful day, Clara would look at the sapphire ring on her finger and marvel at how one moment could change a life. One man arriving late, one unconventional choice, and one woman who refused to give up. She had come to understand a powerful truth. All those rejections had not been failures. They were just clearing the path, pushing her forward to make sure she was standing on that specific platform on that specific day when Jonah Mercer finally arrived. He did not see a last resort. He saw exactly the partner he needed. That simple act of being truly seen had changed everything. It gave her the strength to build a new life from the ashes of what she thought were failures. Looking back from a life full of love and purpose, Clara knew she had never truly been unwanted. She had just been waiting for the right person at the right moment to see her for who she was all along. And when that moment came, she was ready. She had been tested by fire and proven strong enough to build a legacy, finally understanding she had always been worth choosing. She just needed to wait for someone wise enough to see it. And she had. The end.